Well, hello. It's time for us to do our study of the book of Daniel. We appreciate you being with us today as we come together to study the Word of God and to look at these things together. We are in chapter 5 of the book of Daniel. We are progressing along pretty quickly. We're about to be halfway through with this book already. Still in a very historical section of the book of Daniel. And some things that will be helpful for you is, of course, get your Bible, get your outline. Hope you picked one up today or you've downloaded it from our website. And then to get comfortable, open your Bible and let's just engage in the study together. These are wonderful things to do together. And if you've missed any of these lessons, it's not like you've missed a class and now you're behind. You can go back to our website, pick these up on our video, and then you'll be able to stay up with us on our study. Last time we were in chapter 4. In chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had this vision of a giant tree. The tree was cut down, and person's mind was changed to be like that of a beast. He ate grass and lived in the fields until he learned a lesson. And the lesson was that God is the most sovereign. God is the ruler of heaven and earth. God was the one who put Nebuchadnezzar in that position. Well, since Daniel interpreted that dream and that vision, a year passed and Nebuchadnezzar was on his balcony of his palace and bragging about how all these things he had accomplished for his glory. And instantly, a voice from heaven came, his mind was changed, and he became like a beast of the field. He learned the lesson. He humbled himself. Now, that's going to carry over into our lesson today. Now, as we begin chapter 5, Nebuchadnezzar is not talked about. About 25 to 30 years now have passed between chapter 4 and chapter 5. Now, the thought that comes to our mind, of course, is what happened during those years and what's all the details, what was Daniel doing, and a lot of those things we simply do not know. But it begins with Belshazzar the king in chapter 5, verse 1. And from this chapter, this is where we get some great expressions we use in everyday life. The handwriting on the wall, that's going to come from this chapter. Weighed in the balances and found guilty, that comes from this chapter. And your days are numbered, that all comes from this chapter. And we're going to read about this big feast that Belshazzar has, and a hand appears, and 3 words are written on there. And all of a sudden, things change. And what we see in chapter 5, as we do kind of an overview of this, as the chapter ends, this is going to be the ending of the Babylonian Empire. And this goes all the way back to chapter 2 now. Remember when there was that statue and that vision that Nebuchadnezzar saw? The head was gold, which was Babylon, and then after that would come another kingdom. That takes place in this chapter. So what we read about in chapter 5 is the transition from the Babylonians to the Medes and the Persians. And what we read about is the end of the Babylonian kingdom. And it doesn't end well. And so 25 to 30 years have passed. Daniel now is an old man. He's 70s, 80s years old. And still in the working with the wise men of Babylon and doing the things with that. And so on your outline, underneath the section called Background, Nebuchadnezzar dies in year 562. The end of chapter 5 is going to take place in 539. And so about 30 years are going to be covered here. And so since Nebuchadnezzar has died, there's been a lot of turmoil and a lot of kings. Nebuchadnezzar reigned for a long time, and after his death, there was just a lot of struggling. You see on the right-hand side in this pink box here, a series of kings that takes place. Some reign only 2 years, some reign only a few months. And the last known king was Nebuchadnezzar. And he reigns until 539, and that's when this kingdom comes to the end. Now, chapter 5 begins with the name Belshazzar. And Belshazzar was lost in history. For centuries, there was no record of his name. That gave credit to the critics to think that this story was fictional and written many, many years after the events takes place. A lot of the liberal scholars have scoffed at Daniel actually writing this. This is one of the things that they kind of hung their hat on, that there never was a Belshazzar. He never was king. Well, centuries later, there was in archaeology, there was a discovery of Nabonidus' cylinder. And there's a picture of that on your outline. In that, it refers to Belshazzar as his son. And now what's interesting is Nabonidus is still alive. He's still king, but he's not in Babylon. He has a palace somewhere else, and he's out fighting wars somewhere else. So as he's out fighting wars, he leaves his son, Belshazzar, to run the nation, or basically run Babylon. And what a contrast. I mean, he's so unlike Nebuchadnezzar. Nabonidus had been married to Nebuchadnezzar's daughter. So Belshazzar is the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was proud and arrogant, but he learned a lesson. He was a builder. When we look at Belshazzar, all we see is a party guy. We just see someone who seems to be careless and indifferent. And that's going to have some bearing to come out in this. Underneath the picture of that cylinder, multiple times in this chapter, Nebuchadnezzar is referred to as Belshazzar's father. It says that about 4 different times in 4 different places. He wasn't his father. He was more like his grandfather. And you might say, well, why does it do that? Well, Hezekiah is referred to as the son of David. David was the father of Hezekiah. Yet there were centuries between those two. That was just a common way they wrote in ancient times, that if you're related or you're connected somehow, even though there may be years in between, that's your father and that's your son. And that's just the story behind that. So the story begins with a party. Verse 1, Belshazzar the king held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. And as this is going on, his dad, the king, is out fighting battles, and his dad is losing. And the Syrians and the Persians are pressing on. In fact, they have come and surrounded Babylon. And that gives thought to, why is he doing this feast when the city is being surrounded? And that takes us to this gray box beside us. Some believe that this was an annual feast and he's going to keep it regardless. Others hold the view, and I kind of think this is more likely true, that Babylon had been so strong through all these years that his arrogance thought that even though the enemies on the other side of the walls, our walls are so thick, so strong, there's no way he can get through. And we'll see here in just a moment that they're going to be toasting their gods of Babylon. The gods of Babylon had given them victory after victory in their minds. They had given them victory over Judah, but actually it was God who allowed that, but they didn't see that. So big banquets going on, even though there's turmoil outside the walls, they seem to be indifferent to this. Belshazzar, verse 2, tasted the wine, and that's more than tasted. The language there means he was under the effects of wine. He was drunk. He gave orders to bring the gold and silver vessels which Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, so that the king, his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. At this point, what Nebuchadnezzar did is he had taken these vessels from Jerusalem, from the temple, and he put them in the temple of his God. And as far as we know, that's where they were. But now Belshazzar brings them out. They're going to fill them with wine. And verse 3 says, then he brought the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God, which was in Jerusalem. And the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank from the wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. And there's two, and you'll notice this on the outline, there's 2 blasphemous and insulting things here. First of all, they're not doing this as a religious ceremony. This is a drunken feast. Common concubines, not even married to the king, are drinking from the vessels of God. Vessels that only sanctified, clean priests of Judah could drink from. And yet here it's being done this way. And now they're taking these vessels that belong to God and they're toasting the gods of Babylon. They're mocking Jehovah. And so as this is going on, suddenly, verse 5, the fingers of a man's hand emerged and writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the back of the hand and that did the writing. Not a whole person, just a hand. Now, my thought first is, whose hand is that? Is it God's hand? We remember in the book of John that God is a spirit. God made this hand appear. Interesting, he brought just a hand. Not the whole arm, not the whole body of a person, just a hand. We understand from writings that oftentimes when one nation would conquer another nation, that they would cut off one hand, usually the right hand, of a warrior. This would make him incapable of fighting anymore, and it would be used to mock him and display that we have defeated you. Well, here appears a hand. And we're thinking of it as the hand of God. And to show that you think you defeated the God of Judah. Here is his hand. And his hand's writing a message. And how impressive that would be. Now, unlike Nebuchadnezzar, when he had his visions and his dreams, that took place at night when he's on his bed. This is before a banquet. This is before 1,000 people. Everyone sees this hand now. Everyone sees these words that are written. This is the message that you cannot hide. Everyone's going to know about these things. And the king's face, verse 6, grew pale. His thoughts alarmed him. His hip joints went slack. His knees began knocking together. He's terrified. You don't just see a hand showing up without the rest of a body and writings on the wall. The king called aloud, or we'd say he shouted, to bring in the conjurers, the Chaldeans, and the diviners. The king spoke and said to the wise men of Babylon, any man who can read this inscription and explain this interpretation to me shall be clothed with purple, which is a sign of royalty, have a necklace of gold around his neck, and have authority as third in the ruler of the kingdom. Now remember, Belshazzar's dad is still alive, so he's still the king. He's number one. Belshazzar's running Babylon. He's number two. So whoever can interpret this dream and give the interpretation of it correctly is going to be ranked number 3 in the kingdom. And once again, none of the wise men can do it. This is the third time they failed. I think I'd start firing these guys. They're kind of worthless. They couldn't do anything with Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2. They couldn't do anything with the dream in chapter 4. Here they are again, and they still can't do anything. And once again, Daniel's brought in. But this time, the queen, verse 10, which may have been Belshazzar's mother. She was the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. She would have known about all these things through her father. Her father sent out that proclamation in chapter 4 that was to be read in the entire empire. So she would have known about these things. And so she tells them about Daniel. And so Daniel, verse 13, is brought in once again to save the day. Only Daniel can understand the message from God. And he says in verse 14, the king, I've heard about you, that you have a spirit of the gods in you, and that illumination, insight, extraordinary wisdom has been given to you. He talks about in verse 15 how his wise men could not do anything. And verse 16, I personally have heard about you, and that you're able to give interpretations and solve difficult problems. Now, if you're able to read the inscription and make its interpretation known to me, you'll be clothed with purple, wear authority as the third ruler in the kingdom. Verse 17, Daniel doesn't want any of that. He doesn't care about that. Now, what's interesting, from verse 18 down to verse 24, that's not the interpretation. Daniel preaches. Daniel's tone is different than what it is with Nebuchadnezzar. When Nebuchadnezzar had that final vision in chapter 4, it broke Daniel's heart. Daniel says, I wish this was spoken to your enemies and not you. Daniel here is upset. Daniel's serious. His tone is very serious. And so he preaches to this king. Then he gives the interpretation. And so what he says here, he takes him back to Nebuchadnezzar. O king, the most high God granted sovereignty, grandeur, glory, majesty to Nebuchadnezzar your father. You see, he said he's heard about Daniel. Well, if you heard about Daniel, you would have known this. Because of the grandeur which he bestowed on him, verse 19, all the peoples, nations, men of every language feared and trembled before him. Whomever he wished he killed, and whomever he wished he spared he alive. And whomever he wished he elevated, and whomever he wished he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit became so proud, and he behaved arrogantly, that's chapter 4, he was disposed from the royal throne, and his glory was taken away from him. He was also driven away from mankind, and his heart was made like that of the beasts, and his dwelling place was like the wild donkeys. He was given grass to eat like cattle. His body was drenched with dew of heaven until he recognized that the Most High God is ruler over the realm of mankind, and that he sets over it whomever he wishes. Yet you, I want you to notice verse 22. Daniel's preaching. This is what God has done in the past. Your grandfather, called him your father, was arrogant. God taught him a lesson. Yet you, his son, verse 22, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all of this. Do you think you're different, is what Daniel's saying? Don't you think there was a lesson there that you should have walked in his steps as well? What makes you so different from Nebuchadnezzar? But you have exalted yourself, verse 23, against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before you. You and your nobles, your wives, and your concubines have been drinking wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which you do not see, hear, or understand, mocking their gods. Their gods are not real gods, but the God in whose hand are your life breath and your ways, you have not glorified. That's the point of this chapter. Now, up to this point, the king doesn't know what these words on the wall are. Daniel has not been interpreting them yet. Daniel has been thumping him. Daniel has been saying, you should have acted better. You had no reason to be the way that you are. Not only did you know from Nebuchadnezzar, but you mocked the God who's given you life and given you this position. So then, verse 24, the hand was sent from him, from God. And this is the inscription that were written out. Now we find in verse 25 a series of 4 words. Mina, Mina, Tekel, Upharsin. Those are Aramaic words. And each of those words is a short sentence. Each of them belong in the financial community. Each of them represent a type of money going from a higher value down to a lower value. But each of them also has a representation about weights. Mina, as you notice in the blue box on your outline here, represents 50 shekels. That word can mean to count or number. So in the financial community, you'd be counting money. The next word, tekel, means 1 shekel. That's a financial number. But it also means to weigh things. So these are weights, and you would weigh that out. And then Upharsin was a half shekel. So we're going from greater value to a lesser value. And it means to divide. Putting these 3 words together, numbered, weighed, and divided. And so this is the interpretation, verse 26, of the message. Mina, God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Tekel, verse 27, you've been weighed on the shekels and found deficient. You have been found lacking, we could say. And Upharsin, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. So what God is doing here is saying, it's over. It's over. And this comes to an end. Now, verse 29, then Belshazzar gave orders and clothed Daniel with purple and put a necklace of gold around his neck and issued a proclamation concerning him that he now had authority as a 3rd ruler in the kingdom. Verse 30, that same night, you see that? That same night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain. And historically, here's what we know. The Tigris River flowed through the city of Babylon. The walls were built around the river. So from the north side to the south side, the river went through. And what the Medes and the Persians did is upstream, they built some trenches and they diverted the river. And so when you got to the walls of Babylon, it became a dry riverbed. And what they did is they could march under the walls and go into the city, and they took it. And that night, the night of that party, the night that the hand was on the wall, God's not given this king a chance to change. Unlike Nebuchadnezzar, he's not saying until you learn the lesson. God was through with this king, and God was through with Babylon. That night, he was slain. Thousands within Babylon were killed. And the kingdom turned over to the Medes and the Persians. And so it says in verse 30, that same night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain. So Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. This is the beginning of the fulfillment of the chapter 2 dream. The head of gold was Babylon. After you will come another kingdom. Here it is. And that was the emphasis placed upon that. Now, Daniel is elevated to third in the kingdom, kind of like Joseph was. But that's going to be short-lived because the kingdom changes that night. And so all the honor and all the prestige really doesn't last very long because now comes the Persians and the Medes, and it's a new kingdom. Now, a couple lessons we have to learn from this. Let's go to the New Testament and look at a couple places. On your outline, you'll notice this in the book of 1 Corinthians, chapter 10. The lesson about the mistakes of others. That's why we have them in our Bible. We see about David and Bathsheba. And we see about Cain and his sacrifice. We see Nadab and Abihu and how they offered a strange fire to God. We see Peter denying and Judas betraying. All these examples in our Bible of people making wrong choices. We ought to learn from these things. Paul would say in the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 10, as he talks about Israel from long ago, he says that they all, verse 4, drank from the same spiritual rock. They were drinking from a spiritual rock which followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not well pleased because they were laid low in the wilderness. Verse 6, now these things happened as an example for us, so we would not crave evil things as they also craved. Do not be idolaters as some of them were, verse 7 says, nor less act immorally as some of them did, verse 8. Verse 9, let's not try the Lord as some of them did, verse 9, nor grumble as some of them did, verse 10. Verse 11, now these things happened to them as an example, and they're written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore, verse 12, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. God has put these examples in the Bible so we learn we don't have to make the same mistakes. And so when we think about Belshazzar, he knew these things. And Daniel would say in verse 22, you have not humbled your heart even though you knew all of this. You learned nothing from the story of Nebuchadnezzar. And the question comes to us. Have we learned anything from Nebuchadnezzar? Does our pride get in the way of us? When we read about the mistakes of others, do we take it to heart? Do we change our ways? Do we have to walk in the same wrong direction as these people walk? Or can we learn and do what's wise? That's a powerful lesson for us. And that's why Daniel's kind of thumping Belshazzar. There's no reason for this. There's no reason for you to be so arrogant. There's no reason for you to bring out these vessels that belong to the Jehovah God of heaven and earth, and you mock him and praise your gods to them. You should have known these things. But he didn't. And he didn't. And then the other New Testament passage I want to look at is in the book of Revelation, chapter 18. And here it talks about the fall of Babylon. And this is prophesied in the book of Isaiah as well. But in Revelation chapter 18, it says, after these things, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illumined with his glory. And he cried out with a mighty voice, saying, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place of demons and a prison of every unclean spirit and a prison of every unclean and hateful bird. For all the nations have drunk of the wine of the passion of her immorality. The kings of the earth have committed acts of immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth have become rich by the wealth of her sensuality. Now, here in Revelation, he's referring to Rome, but Rome is a symbol of Babylon. And as Babylon fell in that drunken feast, how we see the same lesson being taught once again. And so, interesting thoughts for us today. Years later, we've seen the end of this great nation. And what we're seeing here is Daniel's still around. Daniel's still the prophet of God and still serving in the capacity of God. And for you and I, the takeaway, of course, is we need to learn the lessons. We need to learn the lessons that God has taught us in the Bible. We need to learn the lesson from others. When we see others, our parents, our grandparents, have made mistakes in their marriages, made mistakes in how they honored God and worshiped God, we don't have to make those same mistakes. Do we not learn anything from these things? Our nation could do well to think about this today. They're repeating some same mistakes as done generations ago. But for the people of God, we need to take this to heart. And we need to see how valuable these lessons are. Great studies. I mean, I love the book of Daniel. It's powerful for us. It teaches so many things that can help us in our daily walk with God. I hope this has been helpful for you. In the process of all this, if you've got some questions and some things I don't cover, send me an email or call me or text me, and we'll try to cover that in another time, or I'll talk to you privately about these things. Great study, and I hope it helps you as you walk with God. Have a great day today. Thank you.